now to introduce Dr. Gary Thompson. Dr. Thompson is a clinically and educationally trained doctor of psychology. He has been a strong advocate for children with special needs and their parents in educational settings. He has represented over 500 children in various school settings in 25 different school districts across the country. Among his impressive list of credentials, Dr. Thompson holds a bachelor degree in communications, pre-law, a master's degree, and a doctor of psychology. He also completed an award-winning doctoral training internship and received 2 years of pediatric neuropsychological assessment training. Dr. Thompson is a certified civil litigation paralegal with 10 years of litigation experience. He now exclusively devotes his time to consulting with parents about education options and interventions for gifted and special education children. He and his wife, Dr. Frances Thompson, who also is a licensed clinical psychologist and current CEO of Early Child Psychology and Education Center, are the parents of 4 children. On a personal note, I, like many other parents across the country, have been blessed to come to know Dr. Thompson. He has given validation to our instincts and a voice to our concerns, and he stands with parents across the country. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Gary Thompson.
Good afternoon, Idaho. By a show of hands, how many people came here from Utah and drove 2 or 3 hours? Wow, I was talking with my wife and kids. Talking with my wife and kids about you all who drive 3 hours out here. And they said, Dad, honey, we wouldn't drive 5 minutes to hear you. So I appreciate you all taking the drive. I'm a little distracted too. My 18-year-old, 19-year-old, and 24-year-old months ago set up a Halloween party for this night. Yeah. No parental supervision whatsoever. Can you all hear me back there? Everything?
Louder.
Here, can we turn it up a little bit?
Yeah.
I don't know how to. Because I'm old. I just want to clear some things up because this is the last time I will ever be doing this, and so I think it's appropriate that we take a little time to take the trash out. There's a lot of contention in America, racially, politically, school boards against teachers. There's just a ton of tension. And one other aspect that I just want to it's just driving me crazy. This has got to stop. The whole right-wing nutbag issue, for anyone who has a issue or a problem with any aspect of Common Core. I was born and raised in Los Angeles. I did my residency with my wife in San Francisco. In 2008, I campaigned for President Barack Obama and voted for him as a resident of San Francisco. There's just a lot of contention when it comes to Common Core. And I changed some things in this presentation. I was reviewing late last night, probably about 2 in the morning, just some hate mail and different bloggers, but this guy caught my attention. And he had saw me speak in Colorado, and he's a very popular blogger, and this is what he wrote, partially. From a quick glance, Dr. Thompson just found a home in the Tea Party, tinfoil hat wing of the anti-Common Core group. This is Sean Johnson. He is a doctorate in curriculum and instruction. He also blogs part-time for Huffington Post. That's fine, that's just a label. But the next slide really rocked me to the core, and it was at that point of time, at 2 in the morning, that I decided I can never speak on this subject again publicly. I found time and again that standing alongside activists like Dr. Thompson, even when armed with the evidence and good science, is not worth the effort. That's all I have for you tonight. I have evidence and good science. I am a doctor of clinical psychology. I'm not an activist. I'm not a minister. I am a doctor. And that's all I can give you tonight, is coming armed with the evidence and good science. But Dr. Johnson might be right. It might not be worth the effort. And I think that's where we've come right now as a society and as a nation. And this is why I will not do this anymore. A woman that I deeply admire, Dr. Maya Angelou, who is a poet laureate and received the Presidential Medal of Valor Award from President Barack Obama. She also had some things to say about Common Core, which I didn't find out about until last night. She didn't like the testing and the abuse of it. And in fact, she and several other educators wrote a letter to the president before she passed. And partially it said, "We, the undersigned children book authors and illustrators, write to express our concern for our readers, their parents, and teachers. We are alarmed at the negative impact of excessive school testing mandates. Recent policy changes by your administration to evaluate teachers based on student test scores impose more standardized exams and crowd out exploration. We urge you to reverse the narrowing of curriculum that has resulted from a fixation of high-stakes testing. Our children also lack exposure to our country's rich cultural heritage. We offer our full support for our campaign to change the way we assess learning so that schools nurture creativity, exploration from the first day of school through high school graduation." Maya Angelou. See a right wing nutbag? I don't think so. How about this other group? The Chicago's Teacher Union. I don't think so. I don't think so. They came out with a position paper against Common Core and also the excessive testing. But we have become so fixated on labeling, and I didn't know the extent of it because I was very naive. I was just a doctor, and if somebody called me up and wanted me to come on their radio show or interview with them or go on a television show, you know, I was going to go. And 2 years ago, I went on this guy's show. I've never seen 30 seconds of Lynn Beck in my life. But he was a nice guy, and we shared a value on something. And so I went on his show and I talked about it. And it changed my life, and not so much for the positive. The reaction of the nation and the community was startling in nature. So tonight, we're going to talk about science. Every word that comes out of my mouth pretty much will be backed by peer-reviewed science. And I also have another ethical obligation. My wife is president and CEO of our psychology clinic, and we have an ethical obligation to tell the truth. Specifically, public statements include, but are not limited to, comments used for use in media, statements in lectures and public oral presentations, and public materials. Psychologists do not knowingly make public statements that are false, deceptive, or fraudulent. If I feed you a load of garbage tonight, we lose our ability to feed our children. Not just my wife and I, but the multiple clinicians that are under our employ. Tonight, we're going to talk about peer-reviewed evidence. And we have left a bunch of it in the back. I have made 5 folders about 6 inches thick with peer-reviewed research, one that I've given to the coordinator of Idaho Inn's Common Core, and 5 others that she has handed out to current people in office and education in Idaho, and several candidates who are running. So with that in mind, let's get going. The basis and foundation of everything that I'm going to say boils down to this. Nothing is common about the core of our children. And as such, today I speak to you as both a doctor of clinical psychology and as a father of 4 children. And speaking of a doctor and a dad, this is my father with my nephew, my father retired 6 months ago as a medical doctor in the community after 52 years of service. He did not miss one day of work in 52 years. I remember growing up, my dad would come home from work and I'd say, "Hey Dad, how was work?" And he said, "Boy, I don't work, I practice." And it took me years to figure it out, but he does not work at medicine, he practices medicine. And the same with clinical psychology when it comes to assessing your kids' emotional issues, cognitive issues, and as well as academic testing. Testing is an art where you cannot reduce our children to nothing but numbers. My children are just as unique as Elisa's, and when I have a professional, either a medical doctor or a clinical psychologist, I want them, when they come out with a report of my child, to come out with a Picasso, as opposed to a stick figure. My children are extremely unique, and I won't get into detail with them, just a very diverse people. But when I take them to a professional, I want the Picasso painted, not the stick figure. In private practice, there are rules for these. We cannot paint a stick figure portrait of your child when you bring our child into the office, because we will lose our jobs. And we must adhere to these ethics, these professional ethics. And these are simply, the test must do what it says it's going to do, the validity studies. You must prove it before you give it to kids. You must acknowledge the limitations of a test. No test built by a human is perfect. The ethics of the American Psychological Association recognize this. And it is by law that we have to tell you as parents any limitations that an academic, cognitive, or emotional test has before your child takes it. And you must have informed consent from the parent. And you can't see the bottom of it, but most of all, it is the Hippocratic Oath. Do no harm. Because when agendas ignore ethics, stick happens. In the private side, before we give a test to anyone, we receive in the mail from the publishers an examiner's manual. It talks about the validity. We look at these as private practitioners to see if this particular test would work for your child. We have, depending upon diversity and a bunch of other issues that they examine. They look at, and this is another test, the Webster's Individual Achievement Test, which I think is the best neuropsychologically based achievement test in the world. This test was normed off of 3,000 students who went through pilot tests with their parents' written consent, and guess what else? These kids who went through this pilot test for this Wechsler test, they were paid. I understand Idaho's kids went through some pilot testing. By a show of hands, anybody get a check? No? Okay. Well, we go through this validity studies so that we can paint a Picasso of your child. So with that in mind, let's look into just a little bit about Common Core testing through the American Institute of Research, SBAC, and Pearson testing. I understand Idaho is going through the Smarter Balanced assessment group. We are using a corporation called American Institute of Research called AIR, and Smarter Balance is creating your ISAT test. But we do share something in common, Idaho and Utah, is that for all intents and purposes, AIR is writing your test. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce you to John Cohen, Vice President of Assessment at American Institute of Research. And in a presentation, he told what exactly is a computer adaptive test. And in a nutshell, all it pretty much means is struggling students get easier items, excelling students get more difficult items. And this is from your Idaho website, and this is their description of Smarter Balance. It will replace existing tests and offer significant improvement over tests of the past. And at the end it says, it meets the needs of all students. In Utah, our SAGE test, we got similarly glowing public relations pieces about our Common Core test, is that it's accurate, that it's fair, that it reflects Utah's cultural values, and it accurately assesses Utah Common Core standards. And we got an additional thing. We had 15 parents review the test, and this was splashed all over the Deseret News, and God bless those 15 parents for their hard work. They said, you know, based upon everything here, we don't feel like it's skewed or there's a political agenda. We feel like it's safe. And those parents gave their stamp of approval. But again, a test must acknowledge its limitations. Not once in any materials from the state of Utah or from the state of Idaho have I ever seen any type of acknowledgement that this test was not perfect. That is a violation of ethics in our profession. But I wanted to know more about the Common Core test, and so I went to meet, like Alyssa, with our superintendent of schools. And I gave him a list of concerns, such as the few that I have mentioned tonight, a long list of concerns. And I also went with our clinic's attorney, Mr. Edward Flint, who had a long list of privacy concerns. He punted the ball, and he sent it directly to the people who were writing the test, AIR, and John Cohen, who I introduced to you earlier. He wrote back to Dr. Midlove, and this is what he had to say. Dear Superintendent, thank you for passing on the concerns by Dr. Thompson and Mr. Flint. AIR shares with them a strong concern for individual privacy. Then he wrote about 4 pages about the privacy. And then he devoted this paragraph to my 12 pages of concerns that I left with our superintendent. On a final note, Dr. Thompson expresses concerns for the test that they appropriately serve students with disabilities. AIR is great, wonderful, we work with disabled students all the time. And in addition, we advise our clients to design tests that adhere to the principles of fair testing outlined by the consortiums for citizens with disabilities. I saw this link, and again, this was posted on the Utah State Office of Education website, and I was really, really, really excited to see the guidelines that the state of Utah had given to protect African American, Latino, autistic, dual exceptional, anxious, depressed, and the list goes on, the type of kids who are vulnerable to high stakes testing. And I clicked this link, and I kid you not, and I made sure that it was still up there. But you click that link, this is where it goes. The test must do what it says it's going to do. You must prove it before giving it to your children. You must acknowledge your test limitations, and most of all, the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. So knowing this, our U.S. Secretary of Education, Arnie Duncan, had a real major shift in how we deal with kids, divergent learners. Regarding these kids, he said, we know that students with disability are held to high expectations and have access to a robust curriculum, they excel. Let me repeat that. For every disabled child in America, with that long list which I gave you, the United States Department of Secretary of Education said, have higher expectations and give them a robust curriculum. The guy he did his conference call with from Tennessee went further, and he said most lag behind because they're not expected to succeed. They need to be given more demanding schoolwork, and they are seldom tested. Autistic, depressed, highly anxious, trauma victims, sexual abuse, domestic violence, kids in high stress poverty, African American children, Latino children, reading disorder, math disorder, dual exceptional, kids with ADHD, kids with psychotic disorder, kids with mood disorders, including suicide, which is rampant in your community and my community. All of these kids must take this test, with the very exception of the 1% of the most cognitively disabled children in your community. This is driving kids crazy. The test plus the stress is problems for students, and it wreaks havoc neurologically on these young developing brains. From Stanford University, we know there are 700 new neural connections per second for a child who is born and at 6 months old and up to 2 years. We have no business messing with the formation of these neural connections. A close friend of mine from back east is an experienced therapist. She was interviewed by this hospital association with this question that was posed to her. And Miss Kalima, Mary Kalima, from New York, gave this answer. Young kids can't engage in the type of critical thinking Common Core calls for that would require a fully developed prefrontal cortex, a part of the brain that is not fully functional until they are adults. She feels that this test doesn't measure learning, but rather resilience and endurance. When agenda ignores science and ethics, stick happens. And again, it wreaks havoc on our brain. And when we force our brains, our children's brains, to do things that they are not ready for or were never designed to do, this is what it looks like. Now, a lot of people have seen this picture. I've seen it for like 6 months. I thought it was like an urban myth until I spoke in Orange County, and I met the best friend of this mother, who was a professional photographer. This child has cancer. Tough child, is a cancer survivor, did not shed a tear, but mom caught this image on camera of her doing math homework under the Common Core. A colleague of mine, Dr. Daniel Cates, had this to say: "We now have a special education compliance policy that is going to try to force the most square of pegs into Secretary Duncan's round hole of test-based accountability." We are literally trying to put a square peg into round holes, and it is harming children neuropsychologically. So Mr. Duncan's shift: high expectations plus harder curriculum plus more demanding schoolwork plus more testing equals career and college ready, autistic, suicidal, dyslexics, learning disabled students. Brilliant. The test must do what it says it's going to do. Can you help me out here, dude? The test must do what it says it's going to do. We must not harm children. And again, just a quick review. Within a snap of a finger, our Secretary of Education literally changed the guidelines for these special education kids, for divergent learners, such as 3 out of my 4 children. What about developmentally appropriate practices? Preschool should not be like regular school. New research shows that teaching kids more and more at younger ages may backfire. This is from the right-wing institutions of Cal Berkeley, MIT, Stanford, and a place called Harvard University. In their study, they came straight out and said direct instruction of these little ones stops exploration and discovery. That direct instruction made children less curious and less likely to discover new information. That it constrains a child's exploration and discovery. Another study came to the conclusion that we're taking away too much recess time for kindergartners and first graders and replacing that with testing. This other study said the results were striking. That there is no lasting benefit whatsoever to direct instruction on these preschoolers and kindergartners. The Alliance for Childhood, 750 of the most acclaimed child development professors and researchers came up with a statement condemning Common Core because basically they came out and said kids need to play. 500. We learn by doing. Children learn by doing. Their brains are wired through hands-on interaction with the physical world, with their teachers, with their parents. Hands-on, not computer on. They are toddlers. They are built to move. They are built to play. They are built to basically go crazy. Let them play. Despite this evidence, this is the major shift that we as a community and parents are experiencing. And what's going on with math? I don't know. I have dyscalculia. I have a math disorder. So I'm not an expert in math curriculum, but I have doctoral level training in clinical neuropsychology. And so I went to the peer review to Stanford University, and this is what they had to say, what is needed for success in math. This is a recent study just published about 9 months ago. They showed an fMRI of photos of kids doing regular math versus the new math. They said the key is drill and memorization of basic math facts, which builds connections in our brain, which helps prepare for higher order thinking. The consequences of not doing this is confusing word problems contribute, and this is their quote, to brain disorganization. Disorganizing young brains can lead to lifelong math impairment. Let me repeat that. Disorganizing young brains can lead to lifelong math impairment. There is no peer-reviewed research that I have been able to find in the last 2 years which supports the practice of the new math communal learning that your children and my children are going through. It does not match up neuropsychologically. It does not do well with the way that our brains were created. So finally, if there are doubts from that these tests can actually measure what they say that it's going to measure, then what are Common Core tests really measuring? Because they can't measure a kid who is completely stressed or depressed. And so, what do they measure? It's what John Cohen said. When you are using a test for accountability, you're not really using it to measure the kid. You are using it to measure the school or the teacher or the district. This is on the video. You can look up now. I quoted him word perfect. Again, the vice president of the company that's writing your test came out publicly and said, this test, we're not using it to measure the kids. And it makes sense, because when you have 99.9% of all kids being forced and required to go there, and you know that at a minimum 30% of them cannot give you a valid score, then why are they there? They're not there for achievement. They're there to measure the school, the teacher, or the district. Remember what Ms. Kalima said. It doesn't measure learning, but rather measures resilience and endurance. Again, the ISAT-2 test, the SAGE test, does not measure learning. They are measuring psychological constructs. In Utah, we had a law, we prepared for this. 2002, we passed a law that says we can measure student behavioral indicators in assessing student performance. This is the last part of what I have. What's the future? And this is fascinating. I don't have a fear of technology or data. We make our living with technology and data. I am excited about what I'm about to show you, which is the future of education measurements as a local clinical community scientist. But the future's here. game-based assessment, capturing evidence of learning in play. Because such complex thinking skills can't be measured by traditional standardized tests, education's nationwide educators are turning to new ideals like stealth assessments hidden in video games. Wow. Here's one that was pilot tested in Florida and back east. The pilot testing is done. It's a go. It's in public schools. I don't know if it's in yours. I don't know if it's in mine. But the technology is there where we can gauge social skills by sitting a child down in front of a video game with embedded technology to do a psychological assessment on a child while they're playing Minecraft. They have conferences on this. They have handbooks and books on this. Here is one peer-reviewed paper, Affect States and State Tests, investigating how affect throughout the school year predicts end-of-year learning outcomes. Let me repeat that slowly. How affect, which is emotion, throughout the school year predicts how your kid is going to do in the end of the year. So you measure a kid's emotions and you gather up enough data about that. Before the school year even ends, you can tell whether or not little Johnny is going to pass second grade. We'll know beforehand. They don't care about identified data. They want the whole thing, because the power of data and the power of clinical psychology is the ability to predict. How are we measuring learning without anxiety of high-stakes tests? Step assessments are seamless, so the distinction between learning and assessment is completely blurred. Kids are playing, they are learning, and they are being assessed all at the same time. You've heard of Common Core formative assessments, which what they do all day. This is what's either going on now or will be here really quick. The technology is here. The pilot studies are done. Instead of quizzes and tests that interrupt classroom activity, many districts and testing companies are working on ways to integrate formative assessments into daily instruction and use technology to gather real-time feedback on student progress. The moment they step into that school, all day, every day, they're giving up behavioral and psychological data. Now, as a local clinical community scientist, that's thrilling to me, but as a dad, not so much. But again, we had 15 parents look at these tests. Here's the formula for the game embedded technology that goes into the Minecraft games or whatever games your kids will be playing in school. Again, I have a doctorate in clinical psychology. I don't have the slightest clue, and I am guessing the 15 parents who represented me did not have the slightest clue what to look for. I don't know if any of you heard about this. I found this also last night. Facebook did an experiment on us. 700,000 people. What they did was literally alter little things in our feeds, things that annoy us. And what they did was track our reaction behind our backs, stealthily, without informed consent. And they got popped. Kids is marketing. We can embed products into these games at home and at school without the kids, parents, teachers, board members, your governor knowing. Our associate superintendent said, this isn't bad news, this is new news. What we've done is raise the bar and change the expectation. Oh, you are darn right, Dr. Park. You changed expectations. This is research. In any psychological experiment involving children, there are always risks and rewards. Who gets to decide what these risks and rewards are? With my 4 children, it's me. It is not SBAC, it is not AIR, it is not the Board of Education. It's common ethics. We don't experiment on children. And we certainly don't do so without the consent of parents. We need to know the purpose of the research, and we also need to have the right to decline to participate and to withdraw. I understand. It is my understanding that it is, in both communities, extremely difficult to walk up to your local principal and say, I would like to opt my child out of the SAGE or the ISAT 2 tests. Again, with research, we need to be aware of potential risk associated, the limits of confidentiality, and incentives for participation. Earlier I told you about kids went through our pilot testing for the private test, and they were paid. You had a private test company for free use millions of your children for research for these pilot tests for free. Our children were literal guinea pigs. Bill Gates says this stuff would be great if it worked, but we won't know for 10 years. Guess what, Bill? Try it on your child, not ours. In Utah, I'm not a lawyer, but this is just pulling up the law, that these tests shall be considered in determining students' academic grades and whether or not a kid shall advance to the next grade. I understand that the ISAT 2 will be similar starting in 2015. You are going to use an experimental computer adaptive test that has never been done before on this level in the history of mankind, and you're going to have kids' graduation right on it. And more importantly, if you're a teacher, you're going to let this become part of whether or not you're able to feed your kid. I understand you have something called tiered licensure up for debate here. How about this test? Chicago Teachers Union, well, this is how they responded to that. They were not happy. When agenda ignores science and ethics and parents and teachers unions, stick happens, which is child abuse. And again, going back to Mr. Johnson, he also wrote, referring to testing as child abuse, even though it is abusive in many respects, I think undercuts anti-testing arguments and is insulting to victims of more severe forms of abuse. Are you kidding me? My translation of what he said. Yes, your spoiled child is getting abused, but not as bad as some. The fact that you can't deal with it is insulting. Even when armed with evidence and good science, it's not worth the effort. Do no harm. We don't stand up for children. What do we stand up for? This Colorado teacher, Peggy Robinson, after months of watching autistic children flopping on the ground, or kids with some neurological issues or anxiety and depression, and girls, teenage girls, started cutting during the test. She exploded and said, "This is child abuse. I will not participate as a teacher. I refuse to do it." Martin Luther King wrote, "Academic freedom is a reality today because Socrates practiced civil disobedience." You do what you have to do to protect your children. The teachers' unions talked about the core, Chicago's. And they said they were piloted incorrectly, they were implemented too quickly, and as a result produced numerously developmentally inappropriate expectations that do not reflect the learning needs of students. And they went on more, and I'm going to quickly end here. Bottom line is, great minds discuss ideas. Average minds discuss events. Small minds discuss people. This is what I've had to endure for the last 22 months, along with some death threats. I have to have a police officer here because of this. Truth has no agenda, ladies and gentlemen. My beautiful youngest two daughters, unique. I will do anything and everything as a doctor and as a dad to protect them from harm. Love without agenda. And in closing, my wife's here. She was the top of our class in our graduate school. She was the top of our internship. She was the top of our residency. She is a brilliant, brilliant child psychologist. And more importantly than that, she is a fantastic wife and a brilliant mother to my 4 children. Thank you so much.